So in today's lesson, we're going to continue our conversation about the endocrine system. So yesterday we looked at hormones that affect blood sugar level, looking at the primary organ being the pancreas, and glucagon and insulin working to maintain a set point. In today's lesson, we're going to learn about the thyroid gland and how the hormones that it secretes affect metabolism, metabolic processes, and the rate of those processes. So let's get oriented a little bit here. Here's our thyroid gland, located between the larynx, your voice box, and your trachea, sort of in your neck area. And if you were to zoom in on the thyroid gland, then you'd see these little itty-bitty parts on it, and those are your parathyroid glands. And together they work in different ways to regulate metabolism and growth. So just as with blood sugar level, we had insulin and glucagon being the primary hormones involved. The thyroid gland releases thyroxine and triiodothyronine, and T4 and T3 respectively, to control metabolic rates. So let's talk about metabolic rates in terms of something that will make sense to you or you can relate to. So there are people who, I'm sure that you know, we all know these people who can eat 2 or 3 pizzas and not gain an ounce. And then there are, so those people are said to have a high metabolic rate or a high metabolism. Whereas there are those people who simply look at food and seem to gain 10 pounds. And those people would be said to have a slow metabolism. And so when we look at what's controlling those different metabolic rates, one of the factors that is responsible is this hormone thyroxine. And what thyroxine does is it boosts the oxidation of glucose. So the more thyroxine that is present or excreted in your body, the faster your sugars are going to get processed into energy. And so if you're able to process your sugars really, really quickly, then there's not going to be a whole lot of glycogen stores that can turn into fat stores. But more on that in a second. So a couple of key points here on thyroxine to jot down. So those people who are secreting higher than normal levels of T4, that's the thyroxine, are going to be able to oxidize your glucose, your sugars, at a much faster rate. So in other words, any of the glucose that makes its way into your bloodstream is not going to be stored as glycogen or fat for that matter. It's going to get processed into energy, you're going to be able to use that energy, and those people are going to remain fairly thin. They're not going to be able to gain weight very easily. Conversely, those that are that for whatever reason are secreting lower levels of thyroxine, they're going to not be able to use the sugar that's in their bloodstream because it's not getting oxidized as quickly, and so it's going to get stored as glycogen in order to maintain that constant blood sugar level. So eventually those glycogen stores, though, do get full, and where do they go instead? They get stored as adipose fat, as adipose tissue. As are many homeostatic mechanisms, the T4 thyroxine release is controlled by a negative feedback loop, right? So let's take a look at this. So here's our hypothalamus in this diagram that's in our brain, and here's our pituitary, the anterior pituitary, also in our brain. And both of those components of our nervous system are going to interact with the thyroid gland in our endocrine system in order to control levels of T4. So, and some of this I'll break down in a later section of this note for you. So for now, just take a look and listen. So let's say, for instance, our T4, our thyroxine levels are low. Well, that's a signal that goes to our hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus registers that. And as a result of that registering, that sensing, it releases a hormone called thyroid releasing hormone. And that sends a signal to our pituitary gland. And so the pituitary gland then, as a result of this thyroid releasing hormone reaching it, that signals the release by the pituitary of another hormone called thyroid stimulating hormone. So this hormone, the TSH, is going to stimulate or activate the thyroid to release more T4. And so that's how that loop works. So if there isn't enough T4, the message goes from hypothalamus to release the TRH, which signals the pituitary to release TSH, which then stimulates the thyroid gland. So let's go over that again. So let's say you are not at your set point in terms of your homeostatic set point for metabolic rate. Your hypothalamus detects that, and it's going to stimulate your nervous system to release that TRH, the thyroid releasing hormone. And that TRH, remember, is going to travel to your pituitary gland to stimulate it to release that thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH. Now, TSH is going to travel through the blood to the thyroid gland, which is going to stimulate your thyroid gland to release your T4, your thyroxine, and that's going to lead to an increase in your metabolic rate. So unfortunately, there are some fairly significant disorders that result from a malfunctioning thyroid. And so interestingly enough, and I'm not sure, maybe some of you covered this when you were working on your micronutrient initiative project, but iodine is actually required by our cells. We don't need a whole lot of iodine, but we do need it. And so what happens is if there isn't enough iodine in your body, in your bloodstream, then T4 secretion stops. Okay, so T4 secretion stops, which means that you don't have any thyroxine coming out. So what that tells your hypothalamus, which tells your pituitary, is to release TSH. It's saying there's not enough T4 going out. And so that stimulates the constant release of TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. So as a result, your thyroid basically is getting overstimulated. It's getting constantly stimulated to try and release thyroxine, but it won't. And so how your body kind of tries to counteract the fact that there isn't any thyroxine being released is that you end up with cell division occurring at a high rate. Your thyroid gland is going to swell as a result, and that's what creates these large masses around the area where your thyroid gland is found. And so especially in developing countries, you'll see goiters more frequently than you will in first world nations like Canada. It's not very common. And so one thing that's done to counteract thyroid problems such as the goiter is the fact that table salt, just your regular table salt, maybe you even have a box like this at home, is iodized. So what that means is that iodine has been added in. You can see that if it's on the box there, it should say iodized. In fact, check your cupboard to see. And that just means that that salt has had a little bit of iodine added to it in order to keep your thyroid gland functioning properly. Without iodine, your thyroxine can be produced, and that will cause the overstimulation of your thyroid gland because of TSH being constantly released. So now I want to talk about the parathyroid gland because we've talked about metabolism, but we haven't talked about growth. Parathyroid glands, so here's a bit of a close-up for you. They're located, if we're looking from the back point of view, there's sort of these four little glands here located on the thyroid. Hard to see from a larger diagram. But they're responsible for basically regulating calcium and phosphate levels in our blood. So think quickly, when you think about calcium, what does that make you think about in terms of the human anatomy? Hopefully it makes you think about bones. And so the parathyroid glands are really important for maintaining and developing very strong bones. So one thing that's sort of different about the parathyroid glands to most endocrine glands is that the parathyroid releases PTH directly and controls the secretion of PTH directly from just within itself, as opposed to, let's say, thyroxine that requires coordination with the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, releasing, TRH and TSH respectively. So that makes the parathyroid a little bit different But it is responsible for releasing some calcium ions, and also sort of what follows along with that are phosphate ions. This should have a 3 negative charge. But let's get on to the details. So in your bloodstream, if there is a low level of calcium ion concentration detected in your bloodstream, then your parathyroid will start secreting some parathyroid hormone, some PTH. And that's going to kind of initiate a few processes to occur. So one thing that was not mentioned yet, mostly because it doesn't occur to people right away, is that calcium is actually quite important for muscle functioning. So another reason that we might want some calcium secreted into our bloodstream is because we want to have our muscles functioning properly. Those of you in exercise science may remember that. So bones are in part composed of calcium phosphate. So in order to release calcium from our bones, we also need to have phosphate going along with it through the dissociation of calcium phosphate. So PTH will increase the solubility of calcium phosphate into the bloodstream coming from our bones. Now, another thing that PTH does, another one of its functions, is that it enables the kidney to reabsorb more calcium into the bloodstream as opposed to excreting it out in the urine. However, it does allow us to get rid of the phosphate. So the phosphate gets excreted through the nephron, but calcium is retained. Now, another item that kind of goes along with that is that calcium in our blood, along with our PTH, causes vitamin D to be produced in our large intestine and allows for calcium to be absorbed in our small intestine. So let's go over that again, bit by bit. So low calcium levels in the blood are going to stimulate your parathyroid to release calcium. Where? From your bones. The kidneys are going to be stimulated to return or reabsorb calcium in the nephron. Your intestines are your small intestines are going to be stimulated to absorb more calcium from whatever food is present in your intestines. And vitamin D is going to be produced in your large intestines. So overall, once the calcium level in your blood reaches that set point, that's when your parathyroid gland is going to be is going to stop secreting PTH. It's going to inhibit the production of PTH and the secretion of it from the parathyroid. Now, some disorders of the parathyroid gland can lead to elevated levels of PTH secretion, and you can imagine that if too much PTH is being secreted into the bloodstream, then that's going to come at the expense of your bones. It's coming from your bones, and so that can of course lead to osteoporosis. So here I have a couple of pictures. Now a normal bone is somewhat porous, right, somewhat spongy, but the constant or the overdepletion of calcium in your bones will lead to it being much more porous and brittle and prone to breakage, which is hugely problematic, particularly in the elderly. Now, kidney stones can also result from overproduction and secretion of PTH, because the excess calcium in your bloodstream can cause some of the calcium to be just to precipitate and to form these calcium stones here. And so not all kidney stones are caused by calcium, but certainly some of them are. And if one of them gets dislodged from your kidney and ends up traveling through your ureter to be urinated out, that can be extremely painful, excruciatingly painful, and can cause kidney failure as well. So if you do experience pain in your kidney area, it may be the result of kidney stones, and you should definitely get that checked out sooner rather than later. And so hypersecretion of PTH is bad, but hyposecretion, not enough parathyroid hormone being secreted, can lead to low levels of vitamin D being produced. And so often mothers who are breastfeeding will give their babies vitamin D drops in addition, because there isn't enough vitamin D to support good, strong bone growth in babies. And in fact, if there is not enough vitamin D available to a growing baby, then they can develop a condition called rickets. And so rickets basically results from growing bones not getting enough calcium and them having sort of these bends in them. And it tends to happen in more in developing nations. And there are two different ways that this can exhibit itself. You can have a knock-knee deformation as well as a bow leg deformation. It's caused by the way that the bones end up bending in that particular individual. So that is it for our note on hormones that control metabolism. So we've looked at thyroxine in particular. We've looked at our parathyroid hormone and the mechanisms and disorders associated with them.